The courtroom was packed, filled with people waiting for the trial to begin. The air was heavy, and the tension was noticeable even to those who had no connection to the case. Families, journalists, and curious onlookers whispered among themselves, casting quick glances at the bench where the judge would soon sit. Everyone seemed to sense that today would be unusual, though no one could say exactly why. The trial was about an incident that had happened in the city months ago. A community member had filed a complaint against a police officer, claiming mistreatment during an arrest. Many people knew about it, but few understood the full story. The courtroom, lined with wooden benches and old polished floors, was silent as the first witness was called to the stand. The witness, a young man with careful, calm movements, walked up nervously. He had prepared for this moment for weeks, rehearsing what he would say and hoping that the truth would be enough. As he took the stand and swore to tell the truth, the camera lights flickered, capturing every expression for those following the case on television or online streams. Everything seemed normal at first. The questioning was routine, polite even, but then a police officer who had been involved in the case stepped forward. He began asking questions in a way that seemed standard, but his tone slowly shifted. Instead of maintaining professionalism, he added a remark that made the room stiffen. It was meant as a joke, or at least that seemed to be his intention, but it came across as mocking. The words were sharp, cutting into the atmosphere like an unexpected cold wind. The witness froze, blinking as the comment hung in the air. People in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. Some faces tightened in anger, others in disbelief. Journalists quickly typed on their laptops, trying to record the exchange exactly as it happened. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what was meant to be a small joke could have much larger consequences. After the comment, the rest of the testimony continued, but the tension lingered. Every word from the witness now carried extra weight. Every glance from the officers was analyzed, and every murmur from the crowd was interpreted as support or disapproval. It became clear to everyone that this was no longer just a simple case. It was a reflection of deeper issues. Outside the courtroom, social media began to respond even before the session ended. Clips of the mocking comment started circulating online. Within hours, the video had thousands of views. People were shocked and many expressed outrage. They shared the clips with captions demanding accountability, calling out not just the officer involved, but the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The comment became a symbol, representing a larger story that many had been aware of but few had openly discussed. A journalist covering the case noticed the sudden spike in attention. They had been following the trial quietly, but now the situation demanded a deeper look. It was clear that this was not just about one officer or one joke. It was about a culture that had been allowed to continue without scrutiny. The journalist began digging into past complaints, court documents, and internal reports. Each piece of information built a picture of a department with a history of bias and misconduct, revealing a pattern that went far beyond the single courtroom incident. The young witness, meanwhile, struggled to process what had happened. At first, he felt small, embarrassed, and unsure if speaking up was the right thing. But as he saw the reaction online and in his community, he realized that his words could matter in a way he had never imagined. What he had experienced personally was resonating with thousands of people, shining a light on issues that had been ignored for far too long. Community leaders also began to take notice. Meetings were held to discuss the incident, and discussions about systemic problems in the police department became more open and urgent. People who had previously stayed silent were now speaking up, sharing their own experiences and frustrations. The mocking comment had triggered conversations that could no longer be ignored, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths. Even within the police department, the incident caused unease. Officers who had been aware of complaints and reports found themselves under scrutiny. Discussions that had previously been private and guarded were now happening in public forums, in meetings, and in the media. Some officers felt defensive, insisting that this was an isolated incident. Others acknowledged that the comment reflected a deeper problem, one that they had seen but felt powerless to change. As the trial continued, the courtroom became a stage for more than just legal proceedings. It was a place where truth, accountability, and public awareness intersected. Every session added layers to the story, and every new witness added evidence that the system had been failing in subtle but significant ways. The mocking comment, small in words but large in impact, became the spark for a much-needed conversation. Outside the courtroom, the journalist worked tirelessly to verify facts and collect additional stories. They spoke with people who had previously filed complaints, neighbors who had witnessed similar behavior, and experts in law enforcement accountability. Each conversation added clarity to the larger narrative, that the issue was not just one person, one department, or one city, but part of a national concern about trust, fairness, and systemic injustice. Meanwhile, the community began to rally. Social media campaigns, peaceful protests, and public meetings emerged almost simultaneously. People demanded answers, transparency, and meaningful action. The story of the mocking comment, once a fleeting joke, had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of truth. It reminded everyone that even small moments, when seen in the right light, could have enormous consequences. By the end of the first week after the courtroom incident, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What started as a routine trial was now a focal point for conversations about accountability and reform. The young witness, initially anxious and unsure, began to understand the significance of his role. His experience, amplified by media coverage and public attention, was catalyzing a larger movement. The mocking remark, once intended to belittle, had instead sparked awareness, dialogue, and a growing demand for change. The story of the first courtroom session serves as a reminder that even small actions can ripple outward in ways no one can predict. A single word, a single moment, captured in the right place and time can challenge assumptions, expose injustices, and inspire collective action. In this case, what had seemed like a minor disrespectful joke became the beginning of a journey toward accountability, reform, and a deeper understanding of systemic issues. As people continued to discuss and reflect, it became clear that this was only the beginning. The courtroom had given the first spark, but the fire of awareness and change was still growing. The young witness, the journalist, the community, and even the police department were all players in a story that had suddenly become larger than anyone had anticipated. And while the courtroom incident was just the starting point, its effects were destined to be felt far beyond the wooden benches and echoing walls where it had first occurred. The courtroom incident quickly became the talk of the town. People who had not followed the trial began to watch videos online and read articles about what had happened. The mocking comment from the officer sparked outrage that grew beyond the local community. Social media feeds were flooded with reactions. Many people expressed anger and disappointment. Some shared their own stories, and others demanded that real change take place. Community leaders quickly stepped in. Meetings were held in churches, community centers, and even online forums. Activists, residents, and concerned citizens gathered to discuss what had happened and how it reflected larger problems within the police department. People realized that this incident was not just about a single officer or a single case, but about a system that had long failed to address patterns of bias and discrimination. Protests were organized in a way that was peaceful but determined. Hundreds of people came together holding signs and chanting slogans calling for justice. Local media covered the events, broadcasting images of people standing together in solidarity. The message was clear. The public would no longer tolerate disrespect and injustice. They wanted accountability, transparency, and reform. The young witness who had been mocked in court watched the protests and the media coverage with a mix of emotions. At first, he felt a strange sense of nervousness and doubt. Could one incident really make a difference? But as he saw people across the city and even in other states talking about the issue, he began to understand that his experience had sparked something bigger. He was no longer alone, and his voice mattered more than he had realized. The journalist who had begun investigating the case noticed the growing public interest and used it as an opportunity to dig deeper. They began interviewing other people who had experienced similar treatment, collecting stories that had long been ignored. Each story added weight to the idea that systemic problems existed within the department. These stories were shared with the public through articles, podcasts, and social media posts, helping the community see that this was not an isolated incident. City officials were forced to respond. Statements were issued acknowledging the public's concerns, and promises were made to review internal policies and procedures. While some of these statements were seen as vague or insufficient, they marked the beginning of a shift. People who had felt ignored for years finally saw that their voices were being heard, even if the process of change would take time. Inside the police department, reactions were mixed. Some officers defended the colleague who had made the comment, arguing that it had been intended as a joke and had been blown out of proportion. Others admitted that it reflected a deeper problem, one that they had known about but had not acted on. Tension grew within the department as discussions about ethics, behavior, and accountability became unavoidable. Community organizations took advantage of the momentum to educate people about their rights and ways to report misconduct. Workshops were organized to help citizens understand legal procedures, how to file complaints, and how to engage with local authorities. Activists emphasized the importance of staying informed and involved, teaching people that change required sustained effort and attention. The impact of the incident reached schools and universities as well. Teachers and professors used it as a case study to discuss social justice, systemic bias, and civic responsibility. Students debated and analyzed the situation, exploring why such incidents happen and how communities can respond. These conversations spread awareness among younger generations, helping them understand the importance of speaking up and advocating for fairness. Meanwhile, the officer who had made the mocking comment faced growing scrutiny. His actions were analyzed not only in the context of the courtroom, but also in relation to past behavior. Reports and complaints that had been previously overlooked or dismissed were re-examined. The public attention made it impossible for the department to ignore the issue, forcing leadership to consider real consequences. Local politicians realized that the public response could not be dismissed. They began attending community meetings, listening to concerns, and asking for recommendations. They were reminded that their positions depended on the trust and support of the people they served. The conversation shifted from individual mistakes to systemic solutions, highlighting the need for policies that would prevent similar incidents in the future. As the days passed, the momentum only grew stronger. People from different backgrounds, neighborhoods, and walks of life came together, united by a common goal. The mocking comment had become a catalyst, inspiring collective action that no one could have predicted. It showed that even small moments could ignite larger movements when they touch on fundamental issues of respect, fairness, and justice. The young witness began speaking publicly about his experience. Initially nervous, he found strength in the support of his community. Interviews, panel discussions, and public forums allowed him to share not just the courtroom moment, but also the larger context of systemic bias. His courage inspired others to come forward, creating a ripple effect that brought more stories to light. The journalists' work continued to gain recognition. Their reporting highlighted patterns of misconduct, provided analysis of policies, and connected individual stories to larger trends. Each piece contributed to public understanding and increased pressure on authorities to act. The combination of media coverage, community activism, and public scrutiny made it clear that the issue could no longer be ignored. Community groups also focused on solutions, not just complaints. They proposed new oversight mechanisms, suggested reforms in training and accountability, and worked to create stronger communication channels between residents and police. The energy of the protests and discussions was directed toward constructive actions that could lead to real change. Even small businesses and local institutions joined in, showing support for the movement and encouraging dialogue. Coffee shops hosted town hall meetings, libraries displayed information about citizens' rights, and local artists created murals reflecting the themes of justice and unity. The entire city felt the effects of the incident, transforming it from a courtroom moment into a shared experience of awareness and advocacy. By the end of the second week after the courtroom incident, the situation had evolved from shock and anger into organized action. The public had taken notice, the community had mobilized, and the media had amplified voices that had been unheard for years. The mocking comment that once seemed minor had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the collective power to demand change. The young witness and the journalist continued their work, knowing that this was only the beginning. Their efforts, combined with those of activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens, had created a foundation for broader reform. The city had begun to confront uncomfortable truths, and the momentum suggested that meaningful action could follow. People realized that change was possible when they worked together. The mocking comment, while hurtful and disrespectful, had opened a door that many had felt was closed for years. It sparked a conversation that could no longer be ignored and inspired a growing determination to address systemic problems within the police department. The story of the second part reminds everyone that public awareness and engagement are powerful forces. Even a single moment when witnessed by many can become a turning point. What began as a disrespectful remark in a courtroom had now become a catalyst for reform, mobilizing communities, inspiring dialogue, and creating the conditions for lasting change. It showed that ordinary people, when united by a sense of justice, could hold institutions accountable and demand a better future for everyone. The third week after the courtroom incident brought a deeper understanding of what had happened. The initial outrage had settled into something more focused, as investigations began to reveal layers of misconduct that had been ignored for years. The public and the media were no longer just reacting, they were watching closely, demanding facts and refusing to accept vague answers. Inside the police department, internal reviews were launched. Officers and administrators found themselves under scrutiny as documents, reports, and complaints were examined with new attention. Whistleblowers who had been hesitant to speak up before finally came forward, sharing their knowledge of improper behavior and bias. Each piece of evidence added to a picture that was more complex and troubling than anyone had anticipated. The mocking comment in the courtroom was no longer an isolated event. It had become the gateway to uncovering systemic issues. The journalist who had been following the story worked tirelessly to track down sources and verify information. They interviewed former officers, community members, and legal experts. Many were initially reluctant to speak, fearing retaliation or disbelief. But the growing attention and support from the public gave them courage. Each story they shared revealed how misconduct had been tolerated or overlooked, how complaints had been dismissed, and how trust between the community and law enforcement had eroded over time. Community meetings became intense and emotional. People shared personal stories of mistreatment and discrimination, recounting experiences that had been dismissed for years. Parents spoke of children being unfairly stopped or questioned. Residents shared how the police had reacted differently based on race or neighborhood. Each story fueled public determination for reform and created a sense of shared purpose among those gathered. It was no longer about a single courtroom incident, it was about accountability and justice on a larger scale. The young witness who had been mocked in court continued to play a role in the unfolding story. He spoke at some of the community meetings, sharing not only what had happened to him but also what he had learned from the growing revelations. He became a symbol for those who had long felt voiceless, showing that courage and honesty could make a difference. Though he remained humble and nervous at times, his presence inspired others to share their experiences as well. Meanwhile, the media coverage intensified. Investigative pieces detailed patterns of misconduct, citing specific cases and highlighting trends. Each article and news segment brought new facts to light, helping the public understand that the issue was larger than one department, one officer, or one incident. People across the city and even beyond began to discuss the broader implications for fairness, ethics, and accountability in law enforcement. The public pressure forced city leaders to respond more seriously. They held press conferences, issued statements, and promised independent investigations. While some of their words seemed cautious, the growing awareness made it impossible to ignore the demand for transparency. People began to feel that their concerns were finally being heard. Though they remained vigilant about whether the promises would translate into action, the officer who had made the mocking comment found himself facing consequences. Not only was he under internal review, but his actions were now being examined in the context of prior behavior. Past complaints that had been quietly dismissed were reopened, highlighting a pattern that reinforced the need for systemic change. His case became an example, showing that misconduct, even if it seems minor, could no longer be tolerated in silence. Legal experts and consultants were brought in to review department policies. They examined training programs, disciplinary procedures, and reporting mechanisms. Recommendations for reforms began to take shape, including improved accountability, better oversight, and strategies to prevent bias. the city recognized that addressing these issues would not be quick or easy. But the groundwork for long-term reform was being laid. Community organizations worked alongside the media to educate residents on their rights. Workshops taught people how to document incidents, report misconduct, and participate in oversight committees. The goal was to ensure that future complaints would be taken seriously and that residents would feel empowered to advocate for fairness. These efforts helped build trust among community members, reinforcing the idea that collective action could lead to meaningful change. Schools and universities continued to use the story as a learning tool. Students analyzed the incident and its aftermath, discussing systemic bias, civic responsibility, and ways to foster community engagement. Debates and discussions emphasized critical thinking and encouraged young people to consider their role in shaping a fair and just society. These educational initiatives ensured that the conversation extended beyond immediate news cycles and had a lasting impact. Throughout this period, tension within the police department remained high. Officers debated, argued, and reflected on their responsibilities. Some felt defensive, believing they were being unfairly judged, while others recognized that the culture needed to change. Leadership had to navigate these challenges carefully, balancing internal concerns with public demands for transparency and accountability. Every decision and communication was closely scrutinized, adding pressure to implement real reform. The journalists' reporting began to receive attention from national outlets. Their work connected local patterns to broader issues of systemic bias in law enforcement across the country. Public interest continued to grow, and the story became a reference point for discussions about ethics, accountability, and the need for structural reform. What started as a local incident had now become part of a larger conversation about justice. Community leaders emphasized solutions as well as critique. They proposed independent oversight boards, better training for officers, and transparent reporting systems. Their efforts focused on creating lasting change rather than temporary outrage. They met with city officials and legal experts, presenting ideas grounded in research and experience. The dialogue shifted from anger to strategy, showing that public engagement could translate into meaningful action. Small businesses and local organizations joined in as well. Coffee shops hosted community forums, libraries offered educational sessions, and art projects reflected the themes of justice and accountability. This broad participation created a sense of unity, demonstrating that systemic change required contributions from multiple parts of society. Everyone, from journalists to residents, began to play a role in shaping the outcome. As the third week progressed, it became evident that the mocking comment had sparked more than temporary outrage. It had opened the door to investigations, revealed long-standing patterns of misconduct, and inspired community action. The incident had shifted public perception and forced both the police department and city officials to confront uncomfortable truths. The young witness, the journalist, and community leaders continued their work, showing that persistence and courage could create momentum. Their actions, combined with public engagement and media coverage, ensured that the story would not fade quickly. It had become a catalyst for deeper inquiry and a starting point for reform. By the end of the third week, the story had evolved from an isolated courtroom moment into a multi-layered exploration of justice, ethics, and systemic accountability. It highlighted the power of truth, the impact of courage, and the importance of collective action. Ordinary people were realizing that their voices mattered, that stories could influence change, and that holding institutions accountable was both possible and necessary. This part of the story demonstrates that real reform begins with awareness and investigation. The courtroom comment, initially seen as minor, revealed a much larger reality. Public pressure, media reporting, community engagement, and careful investigation all contributed to a growing understanding of systemic problems. The stage was now set for the next phase, confronting leadership, demanding accountability, and beginning the long process of implementing real change. The momentum from the investigations and public outrage began to reach the highest levels of the police department. Leaders who had previously ignored complaints or downplayed incidents could no longer avoid responsibility. The mocking comment in court, which had seemed small at first, had become a spark that illuminated deeper issues. The pressure on leadership was intense and unrelenting. City officials and department heads held emergency meetings trying to figure out how to respond. Internally, some leaders were defensive, insisting that the officer's comment was harmless and that the department's overall record was good. But external pressure from the community, the media, and legal advocates made it impossible to dismiss the problem. The department was being watched closely, and every decision they made was under public scrutiny. At the same time, public demonstrations and community forums continued. People demanded meetings with leadership, wanting to hear directly from those responsible for oversight. Citizens shared stories of past incidents and expressed frustration at how little had been done to prevent them. Each meeting grew more charged, as leaders faced questions they could not answer without acknowledging the need for reform. The journalist covering the story found that the intensity of public interest brought new information to light. Additional witnesses came forward, sharing experiences that were previously unreported. Each story added weight to the argument that systemic issues were present and that reform was urgently needed. The journalist's work helped to amplify these voices, keeping pressure on leadership and ensuring the public remained informed. Meanwhile, the officer who had made the mocking comment faced growing consequences. Internal reviews considered not just the courtroom incident, but a history of complaints and patterns of behavior. The officer was suspended pending investigation, and the possibility of formal charges was raised. While some within the department resisted these actions, public and media pressure left little choice for leadership. Leadership began taking steps to address systemic concerns more broadly. They commissioned independent audits of department policies, reviewed training programs, and started implementing new accountability procedures. The process was slow and met with resistance from some officers, but the commitment to change was clear. Leaders realized that the public would not accept half measures and that meaningful reform required structural adjustments. Community leaders continued to play a crucial role. They organized town halls, met with officials, and proposed concrete solutions. Suggestions included new oversight boards, stricter disciplinary measures, and comprehensive bias training for all officers. Their persistent advocacy ensured that reform discussions remained focused on practical outcomes rather than vague promises. The young witness who had been mocked in court continued to engage with the community. Speaking at public events, he emphasized the importance of accountability and fairness. His story, combined with those of other victims and witnesses, created a compelling case for change. People saw that reform was not just about punishing one officer, but about reshaping the culture of the entire department. Media coverage played a pivotal role in maintaining momentum. Stories highlighted the steps leadership was taking and the areas where more work was needed. Investigative articles connected local events to national discussions about police reform, showing that the challenges were not unique to one city. This broader context strengthened public understanding and reinforced the urgency of action. City officials were forced to respond more openly. Press conferences addressed both the specific courtroom incident and the broader systemic concerns. While some statements were cautious, they marked a shift from previous defensiveness. Leaders promised transparency and regular updates on reform efforts, signaling that accountability would no longer be optional. Community organizations worked to ensure that reforms would be implemented effectively. They monitored changes, provided feedback, and educated residents on how to engage with the process. Workshops and informational sessions helped people understand their rights, how to report misconduct, and how to participate in oversight. These initiatives gave citizens practical tools to hold the department accountable. Inside the police department, reactions varied. Some officers embraced the changes, recognizing the need for transparency and fairness. Others remained skeptical, feeling that the reforms were imposed from outside and threatened their traditional practices. Leadership faced the challenge of balancing these internal dynamics while meeting public expectations. Every step forward was accompanied by discussions, adjustments, and efforts to maintain morale without compromising accountability. The city also began to explore long-term solutions. Recommendations from consultants and community leaders included changes to recruitment practices, ongoing training in bias and ethics, and regular performance reviews linked to accountability standards. The goal was to prevent future incidents and build trust between the department and the community. These steps signaled a commitment to sustainable reform rather than temporary fixes. Public engagement remained strong, Residents attended meetings, shared feedback, and continued to voice their expectations. Activists emphasized that vigilance was necessary to ensure promises were kept. The mocking comment that had sparked outrage was now part of a larger narrative, demonstrating how ordinary citizens could influence institutions and demand better governance. The young witness reflected on the journey so far. What had begun as a painful personal experience had transformed into a collective movement for accountability and justice. He recognized that his voice, amplified by the media and supported by the community, had contributed to a process that could prevent future injustices. Though the path forward remained challenging, he felt a sense of purpose and hope. As the fourth part of the story unfolded, it became clear that pressure on leadership was yielding tangible results. Officers were being held accountable, policies were being reviewed, and reform plans were being implemented. The combined efforts of citizens, journalists, community leaders, and victims ensured that the department could no longer ignore systemic issues. What had started as a single mocking comment in a courtroom had evolved into a powerful force for change. The narrative of this part emphasizes that accountability and reform require persistence, courage, and collective action. It shows that leadership cannot ignore public scrutiny, and that meaningful change depends on transparency and commitment. The journey from a courtroom incident to institutional reform illustrates how a single moment, when witnessed and amplified, can spark a transformation that impacts an entire community. By the end of this stage, the foundation for lasting reform had been laid. The department faced challenges, but the trajectory was clear. Accountability, transparency, and systemic change were now central to its operations. The story continued, moving toward the final part, where the impact of these efforts and the lessons learned would be fully realized. The reforms that had begun in the police department started to take shape in the months following the courtroom incident. The once tense relationship between the community and law enforcement slowly began to shift. Policies were revised, accountability mechanisms were established, and ongoing training programs were introduced. The mocking comment that had sparked outrage had evolved into a turning point, setting the stage for meaningful, lasting change. The young witness, who had been at the center of the incident, observed these changes with cautious optimism. At first, he had doubted that any real reform was possible, but seeing the department implement oversight boards, revised procedures, and training programs gave him hope. He continued to speak at public events, reminding both the community and officials that the process of change required attention and persistence. His courage had become a symbol, showing that one voice could spark wider action. Community organizations continued to play a key role. They monitored the department's progress, attended meetings, and encouraged residents to provide feedback. Workshops and public forums helped people understand how to engage constructively with the police and how to hold them accountable for their actions. These efforts ensured that the reforms were not just superficial promises, but practical, enforceable changes that could prevent future misconduct. The officer who had made the mocking comment faced formal disciplinary action. While the consequences were significant, the focus shifted from punishment to culture change. Leadership emphasized that every officer had a responsibility to act ethically and respectfully, and that behaviors reflecting bias or misconduct would not be tolerated. The department made it clear that accountability was not selective. It applied to all members, setting a precedent for future cases. The media continued to cover the story, documenting the progress and highlighting successes as well as areas still needing improvement. Journalists followed training programs, interviewed residents, and shared stories of individuals who had experienced positive change. Their reporting helped maintain public awareness and ensured that reforms were visible and verifiable. The community noticed a gradual improvement in interactions with law enforcement. Officers who had received bias training and participated in revised programs were more respectful and transparent in their actions. Residents reported feeling heard and treated fairly during stops and complaints. While challenges remained, the sense of trust between the community and police slowly began to rebuild, demonstrating that systematic change was possible when accountability and awareness were prioritized. City leaders continued to support the reforms, emphasizing that change required sustained effort. Policies were reviewed regularly, feedback from oversight boards was implemented, and regular reports were made public. This transparency reassured citizens that the process was ongoing and not a temporary reaction to public pressure. The message was clear. Reform was a long-term commitment. Education also played an essential role. Schools, colleges, and community centers integrated discussions about ethics, fairness, and civic responsibility into their programs. Students learned not only about the courtroom incident, but also about the importance of accountability, transparency, and active citizenship. By engaging younger generations, the community ensured that the lessons from this experience would extend far into the future. The young witness reflected on how a single moment had changed so much. The disrespectful comment in the courtroom had seemed small and personal, but it became a catalyst for larger reform. He realized that courage, persistence, and collaboration could transform a negative experience into a powerful opportunity for positive change. This understanding motivated him to continue advocating for fairness, ethics, and justice in his community. Community members also reflected on the journey. Many had participated in protests, meetings, and forums, initially unsure if their efforts would lead to meaningful outcomes. Now, seeing the department take action, they felt a sense of accomplishment. Their voices, combined with those of journalists, whistleblowers, and advocates, had brought about concrete reform. The collective effort demonstrated that ordinary people, when united by purpose, could influence institutions and demand better standards. The department itself recognized the importance of maintaining momentum. Leadership acknowledged that reform was not a one-time event but a continuous process. Regular training, oversight, and communication with the public became standard practices. Officers who embraced these changes were praised, while those resistant faced additional guidance or consequences. Over time, the culture within the department began to shift, emphasizing respect, transparency, and responsibility. Media coverage remained balanced, highlighting both successes and remaining challenges. Stories of improved community interactions, policy updates, and positive feedback helped reinforce that reforms were working. At the same time, reporting on any lapses ensured that accountability remained central. This careful balance helped maintain public trust and emphasize that change required ongoing attention. As months passed, the city saw tangible results. Complaints about misconduct decreased, community trust improved, and residents felt safer interacting with law enforcement. The oversight boards provided guidance and ensured policies were followed consistently. While no system is perfect, the combined efforts of community members, journalists, and reform-minded officials created a model for how accountability and systemic change could work in practice. The young witness often reflected on the broader meaning of his experience. He understood that one incident, when witnessed by the right people and amplified by media and community support, could have a ripple effect far beyond initial expectations. He felt proud that his courage had contributed to meaningful reform and inspired others to take action in their own lives. The incident was no longer a source of embarrassment or pain. It had become a symbol of resilience and progress. Community leaders emphasized that vigilance was essential. They continued monitoring policies, providing input, and educating residents. The reforms were living processes, requiring ongoing effort to ensure they remained effective. This commitment reinforced the idea that change was not temporary, and that the culture of accountability and respect must be nurtured continuously. The city began sharing its experiences with other communities facing similar challenges. Conferences, panels, and workshops highlighted the lessons learned, emphasizing the importance of public engagement, media coverage, and persistent advocacy. The story of how a single courtroom comment triggered broader reform became a powerful example for others seeking accountability and change in their own institutions.